Welcome to History 1302. In this presentation, I'll be talking about an element of the turbulent 1960s, and that is the Vietnam War, which really extends from the mid-1950s all the way to the mid-1970s. But I think most of it fits into the 1960s, and so I'm putting it as a standalone conversation as an element of the turbulent 1960s. Now, in a previous presentation, I actually had this already done, but there was a technical problem and it did not record very well. And that's the Turbulent 1960s Part 1. You'll see the images there, but they didn't record. Anyway, in that presentation, I talked about the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I talked about how it's all turbulent because of all these assassinations. I also discussed how it was turbulent. The 1960s were turbulent because LBJ had a vision of America when he took over called the Great Society. But that failed in large measure, because the Vietnam War sucked up all the money. In a separate presentation, I talked about the civil rights. In this presentation, obviously, it's the Vietnam War, and an element of that will be an era of protest. And that era of protest will show up again in 1960s, I think, Part 2, where I talk about Nixon and Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War. Kent State, that's going to be an element of 1960s Part 2. And so Vietnam is part of all of that. So that's where we're at. In terms of your reading, I don't have a readings assignment on this particular slide. Just use your common sense. Whatever textbook you have that deals with 1302, it's going to have elements of the Vietnam War in it. So just go, use the index, go to the Vietnam War, and read what you need to read on the Vietnam War. So with that, kind of in contrast to what I've done with other slides, instead of having a lot of verbiage first, let me set the stage with a lot of image analysis. And then, very much like civil rights, I'll have two slides that have nothing but verbiage on it, and I'll go from element to element to element. Then I'll have some more icons, a few maps. I'll have an image of some of the major figures, LBJ, Westmoreland, Chu, Key, and some of the other major elements of the major figures in the Vietnam War. So if you feel like you're getting lost in slide 3 and slide 4, just press pause, go back to slide 2, or go forward to slide 5 and 6. And that'll have a lot of the images there that will show you basically what I'm talking about. Some of the icons, for example, on slide 5, there'll be a map that shows the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There will also be some of the other icons, the helicopter, especially a specific type of helicopter called a UH-1, a Huey, a kind of aircraft called a B-52, and they ran special missions called Arc Light, and I have a slide on that. Slide 6, again, it just talks about some of the major figures who are important in the Vietnam War. So if you're on slide 3 or slide 4 and you're a little bit confused about who the people are, press pause, move ahead a couple of slides, and all those individuals will be on different slides. They just didn't fit in with the verbiage. Otherwise, this presentation would just go on forever and ever and ever. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a few pictures, a few images, and kind of set the stage. And then I'll spend a lot of time on slide 3 and slide 4. Just be prepared to take a whole lot of notes. So to set the stage, let's talk first about where we are going to. And that draws us then to the map. North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, especially make a note of that. That'll be important on the next couple of slides. And all of this is in Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia as a region had been controlled by the French going back to the 1880s. And that had been part of their overseas empire. The French had poured in a whole lot of time and money and effort into turning the Vietnam, which was known then as Indochina. to turn it into something productive that the West could, basically exploit, could develop. And that especially was rubber. There are rubber trees that produce sap that can be turned into natural rubber. And even to this very day, any tire or product that is basically made out of rubber, almost any product still needs a certain degree of natural rubber. All the tires that you see on all the cars, at least some of that tire is made out of natural rubber. So the French are going to develop this, but as it turns out, as time went on, the Indo-Chinese did not like being exploited. They didn't like to be a colony. They wanted their country for themselves. And so there was rebellion after rebellion and a lot of resistance against the French. Well, as you're going to find out on the next couple of slides, especially the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the history of Southeast Asia, about Indochina. World War II came along, and the Germans will dominate France back in Europe. Well, in Southeast Asia, all those rubber trees, all those rubber plantations are a strategic target. And the Japanese, allied to Nazi Germany, demanded North Vietnam, or demanded Indochina, as it was then known, be yielded up to them from the French. So it sounds complex, but to make it simple, the Japanese wanted all that rubber. And they asked their German allies to tell the French to yield it up, and the French did. So the Japanese will occupy what was then called Indochina. Well, again, the Japanese were like really, really bad imperialists. They were even worse than us as imperialists because they felt like, they could just like do whatever they wanted. And so there was a lot of harsh oppression. There was a lot of murder. The Japanese were just robbing everything in sight. And however bad of an imperialist anybody else was, the Japanese were much, much, much worse. And all the historians agree on that. That is to say, Max Hastings, S.L.A. Marshall, Gerhard Weinberg, anybody that talks about World War II, they all talk about how bad the Japanese were at occupation. In other words, they'd take over one of these countries, and then they'd rape all the women and murder all the men and steal all the resources. And they were very, very violent and very, very oppressive. So that then begins a resistance movement, and that's what interests us here. And one of the figures is going to be there in the middle, that photograph there, that fellow with the short pants on and those kind of bony legs, that is Ho Chi Minh. He was born in Vietnam. He's Vietnamese. As a young man, he violently resisted the French. This is in the 19-teens and going into the 1920s when he was a young man. He did go to the Soviet Union, this newly formed country that had been Russia, Tsarist Russia, becomes the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And Ho Chi Minh goes there and gets part of his education. But strong note here, Ho Chi Minh was a dedicated communist. He was an idealistic communist. But he also recognized that Soviet-style communism was not going to work in Vietnam. Soviet-style communism depends on a modern industrial economic base. It relies on that entirely. And Vietnam, Indochina, Vietnam, had an entirely agriculturally based economy. And so Soviet-style communism wasn't going to work there. So when we think of Ho Chi Minh, it is useful to imagine him as a nationalist. Ho Chi Minh was communist in his political outlook, but he was a nationalist. He wanted Vietnam for the Vietnamese. He wanted once and for all to get rid of any kind of foreign domination. China had tried to dominate Indochina for years and years and years, centuries. Then the French had come along in the 1880s and gotten control of it. Then the French were kind of out, but then the Japanese were in. And so Ho Chi Minh is going to be dedicated to try to get the Japanese out throughout the 1940s. Well, with that, he's going to start trying to get American help. The Soviet Union is not going to help him, and the Communist Chinese are not in power in China. So Ho Chi Minh does reach out to the Americans, and our guys are resisting the Japanese. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's an old phrase. That's an old saying. And so Ho Chi Minh reaches out to the Americans and said, let's help us against the Japanese. And we do. More about that later. Standing next to Ho Chi Minh in that photograph is none other than Vo Nguyen Giap. Now, Vo Nguyen Giap was one of the most dangerous people on planet Earth because he was a history instructor. And I've kind of made a joke out of this before, but it's all perfectly true. History people that study history, we know all of the tricks. We know all the tricks. We study this thing, we study the documents for a reason. So we can pass on those lessons, not so we can take over the world. But anyway, Vo Nguyen Giap turns into a very important general for the Vietnamese, for the North Vietnamese. In other words, he's a dedicated communist. He is. But he's also very good. He's going to turn into a really an excellent general. And he studies this very hard. He knows what tactics are going to be able to employ, guerrilla tactics. He understands how to get the country through the war effort. So Vo Nguyen Giap, this unassuming, guy with no real military training at all, as it turns out, he's going to out-general our generals. And that's just the way it is. Whether you like it or not, or believe it or not, Vo Nguyen Giap turned into a very, very good general. And he out-generaled our generals. He out-generaled the French generals. So as a military man, a very important figure in Vietnamese history. In the upper right is Secretary of State Dulles. And he is shaking hands with the foreign minister of North Vietnam, and his name is Le Duc Tho. Now, I'll talk about Le Duc Tho later on when we start talking about the Vietnam, when we start talking about the peace talks. And so just remember that fellow there in the funny-looking suit there, that is Le Duc Tho, and he's the foreign minister for North Vietnam. Last but not least, that kind of black and white there in the middle, that is Ho Chi Minh. And that's when he was much, much older. Ho Chi Minh has been dedicated to a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control his entire life. Please write that down. The goal of Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, Le Duc Tho, and Le Duan is to have a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control, under the control of Hanoi. That's that city that you can see there on the map in the north. That was their goal, and to that goal, they stuck to that goal throughout the entire conflict. Many is the other country, many is the foreigner, whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, the French, or even the Americans, who never really, they could never grasp that. Everybody else was prepared to sort of compromise and say, listen, just settle for what you have. But the North Vietnamese in particular, Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, Le Duc Tho, and Le Duan, they insisted on a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control, which is the way it is now. Now, the last figure I want to draw your attention to there is that fellow in the black and white photograph, Le Duan. Now, Le Duan was a dedicated, an absolutely dedicated and bitter hardcore communist. He didn't believe in any kind of compromise at all, politically or economically. And he was absolutely dedicated to a very, very hardcore, very, very far extreme form of communism. And as Ho Chi Minh became older and Vo Nguyen Giap was really dedicated to, being out there on the military side, and Le Duc Tho was, involved as a diplomat. Le Duan, he slowly worked his way up politically and got rid of enemies and made allies as he needed to politically. But when Ho Chi Minh passed away in the late 1960s, 68 or 69, I believe, Le Duan took over as first as the president, then the prime minister, then the premier of North Vietnam. And I want to be clear on this. He is a very mysterious figure today, But at the time, everybody knew who he was, and he was dedicated as a communist, and he was ruthless. He was lethal. He was murderous. Anybody that disagreed with his policies or the way that he approached issues, dealing with the Vietnam War or with, dealing with the United States or anybody else, he would disappear them. And he was a very bitter, diehard, take no prisoners kind of guy. And so many people were basically murdered under Le Duan's rule. Later on, after the war, and this is important, after the war, the Americans are out, and we're very, we're kind of bitter about that. We'd never suffered that kind of a defeat before. Understand, North Vietnam, the Vietnamese War was a negotiated settlement. But we understood in America that we got beat. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do what we wanted to do. More about that later. But Le Duan went on this reign of, going down to the South, rooting out anybody that had any kind of democratic principles, anybody that had aided the Americans during the war. He found them and rooted them out, buried them, killed them. It's called the Killing Fields. Chased them into Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge, they killed him. He was instrumental in dominating Laos and killing tens of thousands, perhaps millions there. Many people in the South could not deal with the economic reforms that Le Duan insisted upon, and so they tried to escape. And this turned into a phenomenon called the boat people. And when I was young, high school sort of thing, the boat people, that was a terrible, terrible tragedy. Because America, we wanted out. We didn't want to have to help any of them. So these people, these refugees, are taken to boats to escape. They can't go to Cambodia. They can't go to Laos. They can't go to Thailand. They certainly don't want to go to China. And so they take to these overcrowded boats with very little supplies. And they're murdered by modern-day pirates, are going to murder and rape them by the thousands. They show up on islands out there and are, just brutalized and exploited, and it's really, really a terrible, terrible story. In other words, they couldn't stay where they were, and leaving was a terrible, terrible, horrifying business. Finally, kind of in the middle of the Ford administration and the beginning of the Carter administration, Americans kind of opened up a little bit, and we had pity on these people, and the press got involved. And so many Vietnamese were able to finally get to America. And so, but the reason why they had to flee their country, Vietnam, South Vietnam, is Le Duan was a monster. He's a brutal, brutal dictator. So those are some of the players that I think you should be familiar with. On the American side, as we go through this, there's also a slide further on down, slide 6, I believe, and that'll have a picture of Lyndon Johnson, General Westmoreland, William Westmoreland, and some of these other figures that are important in, on the American side. All right, so with that in mind, with this little bit of background in mind, let's go on and talk about the war. Now, the next two slides, slide 3 and slide 4, they're nothing but bullet points. And so it could be that when you get ready to take a test, the test will say, okay, the Vietnam War is a major event in American history, which is true. And, tell me everything you know about it. And all you need to do, and this is what I urge you all to do, is screenshot the next two slides, slide 3 and slide 4, and then copy down your notes based on those bullet points that you see there. Otherwise, simply, all I'm going to do is just talk about one of those bullet points and tell you everything you need to know about that bullet point. And then just go on to the next bullet point and then just go right on down the line. All right? This is not a presentation on the Vietnam War. It's a presentation that talks about American involvement in the Vietnam War. And there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's the way I'm going to approach it. So get out a strong sheet of paper and write down a bullet point one at a time. I'm going to go through them right down the line. And just be prepared to write a few notes on every one of these bullet points. All right, so what we're talking about here is the Vietnam War, the timeline. It starts in 1946, and as you can see, it goes to 1967. But then the next page picks up where that leaves off and then brings us all the way to basically 1972, 1973, when the last American soldiers leave Vietnam. Let me start with a little bit of my resources that I used to create this presentation. One of them is a documentary. I'm trying to give you guys resources that are easily available to all of you, and that are very, very good. One is a documentary called Vietnam, the 10,000 Day War. And really briefly on this, Vietnam, the 10,000 Day War, it's a 10-part series created by a journalist named Peter Arnett. Now, Peter Arnett, as a journalist, had been to Vietnam many times while the war was on. And when the war came to an end, he concluded that the best thing he could do is go talk to everybody he could talk to. Get footage, talk to all the people that would talk to him, all the generals, both on the Vietnamese side and on the American side, and even on the French side. And, you know, do interview after interview after interview after interview. So Vietnam, the 10,000 Day War is really authoritative. It's designed to educate. In other words, it's not really taking a point of view. It just shows the chronology and all the events that take place during this terrible, terrible conflict. Added to that is another documentary, and it's called The Fog of War. The Fog of War. So one of the principal people that is involved in the Vietnam War throughout the 1960s is a guy named Robert McNamara. He'll be the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and then later on under LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, for a long time. And in the post-war era, McNamara would not talk about the war. He felt like he was too controversial of a figure. He just wanted to live in retirement, raise his kids, you know, try to get through life. And so in the post-war, in the post-Vietnam era, there are like no interviews of Robert McNamara. He doesn't talk to anybody. He leads a private life. He was wealthy. He had private interests, and he could do that. But then, about, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, right, I think it was in 2012, 2010, something like that. By that time, McNamara was in his 80s, and he was, you know, the end was near for him. He was at the end of his life. And so he invited some people to come in and do a documentary. It's called The Fog of War. And in that, McNamara says, listen, I'm old now. I'm no longer a controversial figure, and I can say what I want to say and, you know, present my point of view to the American people. At a time when the Vietnam War was a fading memory, even the Vietnam veterans are, like, getting much, much older, and the controversy has really, really died down. So McNamara took that opportunity to do, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2-hour documentary. And so of The Fog of War. Very good documentary. Again, very kind of altruistic on McNamara's part. The important thing here is that I want you guys to know is McNamara is saying, listen, everybody was caught up in this great big giant machine that it's unfair to blame any one person. He's not trying to shift responsibility. He claims responsibility. But he's saying that this thing took on a life of its own, and it's part of the Cold War, which is true. Last but not least, Max Hastings, Vietnam and American Tragedy. This is a book about the size of a cinder block. And Max Hastings, an excellent writer, an excellent historian, and he presents a lot of information. He's sort of biased. He's pretty strongly against the North Vietnamese. And he takes a very humanistic approach. Vietnam and American Tragedy, he takes a humanistic approach. And he brings to mind, again, the terrible, terrible casualties that were inflicted during this conflict on the South Vietnamese, on the North Vietnamese, on the Americans. He talks about the casualties a lot. And he lays a lot of responsibility on the North Vietnamese, which is probably where it belongs, especially when you think of the really the Holocaust that Le Duan brought about when he was in charge of Vietnam. So with that in mind, those are my resources. And if you're interested in the Vietnam War, those are 3 resources, easy to get, readily available. And that's kind of what I'm depending upon for this presentation. So with that, let's take a look at the first bullet point. 1945, the U.S., which is the OSS, and this is the Office of Special Services. The OSS, the Office of Special Services, is the forerunner to the modern CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. The United States, 1945, the Office of Special Services, the forerunner to the CIA, is going to assist Ho Chi Minh to get rid of the Japanese. As I pointed out on the previous slide, the Japanese had gotten control of what was then called Indochina from the French because the Nazis were forcing them to. And so the Japanese got control of it, and they were monstrous. They would not put up with any sort of rebellion or resistance, and they would immediately resort to murder if anybody resisted. And they were they were very, very brutal. Well, Ho Chi Minh, who was obviously, he's Vietnamese, he says, well, he had been trying to resist the French and get the French out, and he simply switches to a new target, the Japanese. And Ho Chi Minh reached out to the Americans and said, listen, we're the enemy of the Japanese, you're the enemy of the Japanese, let's work together and get rid of these guys. And so the Americans sent in the OSS, the Office of Special Services. And many of the guys that are like going to be part of this will go on to be big shots in the CIA. But what's important here is we do give them training. We give them weapons. We supply them with food and equipment, radio sets and intelligence. Strong note here. This is really the beginning of a guerrilla warfare and insurgency. In other words, you take guys, you train them all up, and then you tell them, listen, don't put on a uniform. You're a soldier. We're going to recognize you as a soldier. We're going to give you equipment as a soldier and training as a soldier, but you're going to live as a civilian. Because the Japanese, you know, they were from a different culture, different language, different everything. And so the Japanese could not tell, I'm not trying to be racist about this, but they couldn't tell one Vietnamese from another. If you lined a whole bunch of them up, which of them was the insurgent? Which of them was the communist insurgent? And which of them was just a peasant farmer? You couldn't tell. The Japanese certainly couldn't tell. And Ho Chi Minh is going to use that to his advantage. So we aid Ho Chi Minh, give him training, give him weapons and equipment and aid, and we help them out. Strong note here. At the end of World War II, our intelligence guys, the OSS, kept asking the State Department, what is our policy in Indochina? Our guys that were down there, the OSS, kept asking our State Department, what is our policy in Indochina? What will happen going forward? They're asking that question because Ho Chi Minh is asking them. And this is probably our most fundamental and our first mistake. And this is in the late 1940s, 1946, 1947. And this is America's first mistake. The State Department sent a message back to our guys in Indochina saying, stop asking us about this. The State Department was worried about what was going on in Japan. They're worried about what's going on in Europe. They're worried about what the Russians were up to. And, this little speck on a map that, 2 people out of 100 could identify Indochina. The other 98 had no idea on planet Earth where Indochina was at. They didn't know. And so the State Department said, this is so far down on our priorities that we're not even going to give you an answer. And that was a mistake, a very dreadful error. Now, this error gets compounded. 1946, the French reassert their colonial claims. Now, again, Truman is making a mistake here. And the State Department is making a mistake. We underrated, the importance of Southeast Asia, Indochina. But the French want their colonial asset back. They want Indochina back. They want to reclaim their colony. And our guys made a stupid mistake. There's no two ways about it. It's absolutely a stupid mistake. Now, the mistake, you can excuse it by saying that it's short term. We're trying to keep the French as an ally to aid us in Europe. The United States is looking to Europe and all the problems that are going on there in the post-World War II era. We felt like we needed French assistance there. We needed the French. And Charles de Gaulle, who's in charge in France, is saying, he wants his colonies back. And we should not have done that. We should have, resisted that. But the French want their colony back, and the Americans say, you know what, go ahead and get your colony back. And that was a stupid mistake. So, from 1946 to 1954, I'm making a big jump here because most of this does not really involve the United States. But the French are going to go back into Southeast Asia. We betrayed Ho Chi Minh. That's the big note that I want you to take here. We're going to betray our allies, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh in these early days can be counted as more of a nationalist than as a communist. That's just the way it is. But the French go back in. They reassert their claims. They try to put this playboy emperor as a puppet back into Indochina. His name was Bo Dai, B-O-D-A-I, and he was a hereditary imperial leader of Vietnam. But he turned out that he was very Francophile, that he really liked the French, and he spent most of his life in France, gambling and, basically making use of a lot of prostitutes and blowing all the money. So he had very little connection with Vietnam itself, but he was a puppet for the French. So the situation just got worse and worse and worse for the French because Ho Chi Minh is resisting the French just as he had resisted the French before and just as he had resisted the Japanese. Well, we start trying to help the French because we see Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese as a communist threat. Please write that down. Our attitude in Southeast Asia changes because we see Ho Chi Minh as a communist, and we're afraid of the policy containment, the domino theory. We're afraid that if North Vietnam goes communist, they'll take over Laos, then they'll take over Cambodia, then they'll take over Thailand, then they'll take over part of India, and then we're going to have to fight them. So the situation in Vietnam really comes under the heading of Cold War beginning in the mid-1950s. We're afraid of a communist takeover. Now, very strong note here. We were convinced until the very end, until after the war was over with, until the 1970s, that the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh and later Le Duan were actually puppets of the Chinese, and that is false. Please write that down. This is one of the big misconceptions that the Americans had about what was going on in Vietnam. The United States was convinced that Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese were puppets of the Chinese. And that is false. The North Vietnamese were acting on their own initiative. They had their own agenda. And in fact, they were very, very afraid of Chinese domination. The Chinese have been tried to do that for centuries. And the Vietnamese did not like that. 1954, Dien Bien Phu. Now, Dien Bien Phu, if you need to take a look, it's on the previous map. It's on the previous slide. It's on a map. And you can see it out there. Dien Bien Phu was a French mistake. They're going to put a bunch of guys out there, hard-fighting soldiers, paratroopers. They put them out there in this location. It's thought that they were going to stop a supply line from China. That turned out not to be true. But Ho Chi Minh, and as it turns out, Vo Nguyen Giap, who was just then emerging as a very senior general, said, listen, these stupid French have made a stupid mistake, and we now have an opportunity. In other words, Dien Bien Phu is isolated. So the North Vietnamese are able to surround them and compel them to surrender. So 1954, Dien Bien Phu. This is a French surrender. Strong note now. This compels the people of France to say to their political leadership, Get out of Southeast Asia. Get out. Bring our guys home. No more Indochina. No more colonialism. And that stuck. The people of France were no longer interested in spending a vast treasure of money and lots of soldiers and lots of military equipment in Southeast Asia. So the people of France wisely told their leadership, get out of Indochina. And the French government had no choice but to do that. Well, if that sounds like a sort of a presaging what's going to happen with America, that's exactly what happened. The old phrase is that history repeats itself. History does not repeat itself. It rhymes. And Mark Twain said it. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Okay, and this is a rhyme that's like really, really closely related. So 1954, Dien Bien Phu, the French are out. So the United States pressures the United Nations to get involved. That's the next bullet point. The United States pressures the United Nations to get involved. And then the UN went in and said, listen, we're going to stop all the fighting, and everybody has a ceasefire. But South Vietnam is really pro-democracy, and North Vietnam is very, very, very pro-communist. And the UN said to both sides, we're going to artificially divide Vietnam to North and South. And this artificial division will remain, it's called the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. This artificial division will remain, strong note now, until both sides have free and open elections. As I'm recording this, it's 2020, and that has not happened yet. They've never had free and open elections, never. Neither side did. The South always rigged the elections, and the North, they said, yeah, you can have an election, but you better be voting for the Communist Party. We're gonna do you. We're gonna murder you. You're gonna get disappeared. So the UN steps in, divides Vietnam into North and South, contingent upon the idea that when they have free and open elections, and the people decide if they want democracy or communism, then that dividing line will remain until that happens. Well, neither side had free or open elections. So we have a divided Vietnam. 1956, U.S. advisors train the South Vietnamese Army. So 1956, again, this is our first step into this chaos. Eisenhower felt very much compelled to start sending advisors into Vietnam. Again, think policy and containment and domino theory. Vietnam, 1956, the U.S., we're going to execute that policy. Policy, containment, domino theory. In other words, wherever communism was at, in this case North Vietnam, it can remain. But we're not going to allow it to spread. And it was going to spread to South Vietnam. Because, strong note here, which already should be in your notes, the North kept saying their goal is a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control. They never deviated from that. Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, Le Duc Tho, Le Duan, any of their leaders, they all said the same thing on that. They wanted a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control. And so, we felt like we had to send some people in. Now, this is where things are just not going to work. In other words, where the American soldier goes, so goes the American culture. And our guys are going to demand, ice cold beer, and they're going to demand music, and they're going to demand all the creature comforts when they're not in the field. Plus, our guys would get in the field, and they're not really becoming acculturated to the Vietnamese. They're not learning the local language. They're not understanding the local customs. They're going in and using translators, and they're saying, wow, I'm this great big white American. Here's the things that I can do to help you. And they're speaking through South Vietnamese interpreters. And then our guys leave. Well, the communist insurgents were already there. So anybody that colluded with, anybody that collaborated with the Americans, they would be violently, usually murdered. Even Vo Nguyen Giap later on said this phase of the war, 1956 to probably 1961 or 62, he said we made a lot of mistakes. Because anybody that collaborated with the Americans or talked to the Americans or had any kind of connection with the Americans, we would murder them. And that made North Vietnam and the communists look really bad, which they were. But Vo and Jap said this was counterproductive, and it took them years and years and God knows how many dead people to figure out that murdering everybody that collaborated with the Americans or had anything to do with the Americans was, they had to shoot them. They had to kill them. So our guys are there. We're slowly training the Vietnamese. Again, we're giving them modern weapons, modern warfare, modern techniques. We're trying to help them. But as it turns out, again, over time, this is going to be counterproductive. Because Vietnam, South Vietnam, had like no economy. It's an economy based on rice and fish. Well, that's not a kind of economy that can support a big, sophisticated, expensive military. An example of that, our scientists back in America developed what's called super rice. They said, okay, the Vietnam, their economy is based on rice. We'll develop a rice that's called super rice. And the super rice you put in the field and you treat it just like any other kind of rice. But the yield is enormous. And that will create a food surplus. And then with a food surplus, the South Vietnamese can sell that on the open market. They can sell it in Japan. They can sell it on the open market. They can sell it to South America or the United States or to other countries in Southeast Asia. The problem with super rice was that it required a lot of really heavy fertilizer. And the Vietnamese, the farmer, could not afford that. And so it just, we're trying to help and we're trying to come up with the best answers, but it just won't work because our people are not acculturated. They don't really understand what's going on in Southeast Asia. They keep thinking along American terms and not on Vietnamese terms. So 1957, the communist insurgency begins. Now again, this is straight really out of the book. Mao Zedong had kind of perfected this type of war in China. Mao Zedong, as a military thinker, is very underrated. He developed his military thought under the worst conceivable circumstances in China. And very famously, he said, I shall be as a fish in the sea. And what that means is you're just going to you're going to blend in with the culture. You're going to blend in with the society. Speak their language, act like they do, dress like they do, be indistinguishable from anybody else, but with the knowledge that you as an individual, you're a soldier, you're a fighter. You're a captain or a lieutenant or a sergeant or a private in an army. And if you get orders, you go carry those orders out. But then during the day, your day job is just be an ordinary schmo. And so this insurgency is almost impossible for soldiers in the United States to even understand. In other words, we're not speaking any version of Vietnamese, much less have the skill sets to be able to distinguish a North Vietnamese dialect from a South Vietnamese dialect. The locals might be able to do that, but they're not going to rat out an insurgent because our guys are going to be gone at night and the insurgent will probably still be there. And that's how you get shot. That's how you get murdered. All right, so this is extremely difficult to defeat. Strong note now, this is a piece of military science. Even today, our modern military, with all of our modern thinkers and all of our modern education, we don't know how to actually defeat an insurgency. We don't know how to do that. A more modern example, the situation in Syria, the situation in Iraq. It's hard to defeat that insurgency that's going on there because you can't tell one from another. You can't tell a civilian from these fighters. You just can't tell them apart. The Israelis with the Palestinians, they've had a hard time with this ever since World War II, since 1946. They've had a hard time being able to tell an insurgent from just an ordinary Palestinian citizen. They can't tell them apart. It's extremely difficult to do. So insurgencies as a mechanism of war is extremely difficult to defeat. 1964. Now again, take a look at these jumps in dates. 46 to 54, then 56 to 57, then 57 all the way to 64. And so until we get to 1964, things have just been way on the back burner especially in the United States. We're sending a few guys over there, but not many. But 1964, things begin to change. So, first thing in 1964 I want you guys to understand is that Kennedy had been assassinated by this time. Now, I mentioned this in another slide. Let me mention it again here in this context. Kennedy had been assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson will take over. Hereafter, LBJ. So LBJ took over, and strong note here, Kennedy had left no clear policy in Vietnam. Eisenhower had put troops in there, and he had not really created a meaningful policy, except for the policy contained in the domino theory. But that's only in broad terms. And then Kennedy inherited that. Then Kennedy comes along, and he hasn't really gotten a meaningful policy in Southeast Asia. He's had too many other things going on, quite frankly, that out-prioritized what's going on in Indochina, Vietnam. And so he does not have a meaningful policy. So LBJ comes along, and he's like, okay, we're going to settle this we're going to settle this thing once and for all. And that will lead to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Again, if you need to pause the slide and go back to the previous slide and take a look at the map, I pointed out the Gulf of Tonkin in that map. But now I'm talking about it. So 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Strong notes here. This is the beginning of real American involvement in Vietnam. We strongly suspected that the Vietnamese were using the sea as a way to put insurgents into the South. That small boats, small ships were loading up insurgents in North Vietnam, then sailing down to South Vietnam, waiting for dark, and then landing these guys. And we were pretty sure that they were using that as a route to put their insurgents in. And that's true. They were. So we put patrol ships out there. And one of them is called the USS Maddox, M-A-D-D-O-X. The USS Maddox, M-A-D-D-O-X. It's a kind of a light ship. It's a light destroyer, but it can get really close to the shoreline. And so at night, the USS Maddox would patrol really close to the shore. And any like small boats, any small ships that the North Vietnamese would put out there, presumably loaded with insurgents, the USS Maddox would engage them, destroy them. So they're sailing along out there. The sun goes down at the middle of the night, and suddenly there's like shooting. And they're shot at and engaged, and there's like small boats racing around, and they're just shooting the whole place up. Strong note now, that was a real, genuine attack. To be clear, our position was that American ships had been attacked on the high seas. The U.S. Navy was under attack directly by North Vietnam on the high seas. So the next day, that was all reported, and things rock along, and there's a lot of, LBJ's upset, everybody's upset about this. A lot of news conferences, a lot of reports in America, as you can imagine. Well, just a couple of days later, the USS Maddox is joined by another ship called the Turner Joy, T-U-R-N-E-R-J-O-Y, the USS Turner Joy. So again, the sun goes down, the USS Maddox, the Turner Joy are out there. They're patrolling around, and there's shooting, and there's reports of torpedoes in the water, and, lights and flares and machine gun bullets and tracers going left, right, and center. So once again, our guys reported that they'd been fired upon. Strong note. As it turns out, the second attack did not take place. The second attack was the result of nervous sailors, sonar operators that misread the signals that they were getting. And so the second attack did not take place. The first attack was real. That's a documented fact. But the second attack, it was not real. But the report went up saying, yeah, we got attacked the second time. And that led to, strong note, it's not written down, you'll have to write this down. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution. LBJ is going to go to Congress. He's going to report to Congress, listen, our ships have been attacked on the high seas, and I want to be able to retaliate. And that is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Super, super strong notes here. Put an arrow pointing towards it. LED lighting, everything. This is big in American history. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution allows the president, in this case, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, to commit a war without a declaration of war. LBJ, the president, may act as though a war is going on. He can commit to combat operations, but without the declaration of a war. All the leadership in Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, knew that the votes were not there for a declaration of war on North Vietnam. They knew it. Furthermore, the feeling was that if we actually formally declared a war on North Vietnam, the Chinese would get involved, especially, or maybe even the Russians. And we didn't want that. We wanted a limited war. And this is another American mistake. This is an error. We have an open-ended conflict. And the president can wage this war without a declaration of war. Spend all the money and send all the troops, and there's no limits. And so, from that day to this, ladies and gentlemen, America has never declared war on another country again. Because this is a precedent. We've done it for the first time. Only Congress can declare a war. Only Congress can do that. Article 1, Section 8. They're the only ones that can do it. And here they've abrogated their responsibility. They let the executive wage a war without a declaration of war. And the executive has never forgotten that. So when we talk about conflict after conflict after conflict since Vietnam, since the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they keep doing this again and again and again. Getting America involved in a war without a declaration of war. And so as it turns out, in my view, constitutionally, this is like really, really a bad mistake. So, 1965, Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder is a long-term air operation. Rolling Thunder, a long-term air operation. Military thinkers today recognize this as another mistake. We didn't know exactly what we were doing, and the goal of the war was really to preserve South Vietnam. In other words, this is a civil war for which we had no role to play in that, and no meaningful goal in the war except to stop the North Vietnamese. Well, the North Vietnamese had an identifiable goal, a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control. And we had no meaningful goal. Just prevent that from happening. Prevent the North Vietnamese from getting control of South Vietnam. Well, but we're taking over the entire war effort and turning it into a modern, sophisticated, industrial war. Well, the South Vietnamese were never going to be able to do that. So we're fighting a civil war on their behalf. And Rolling Thunder is a part of that. And again, it's seen as a mistake in the way we exhibited it. What we're going to do, very briefly, is we're going to send our bombers up there to North Vietnam. And they're going to bomb important targets that we have identified. Fuel storage, bridges, manufacturing centers, airports and Air Force bases. We're going to bomb those. And then we'll draw back and offer the North Vietnamese some kind of a negotiated settlement. Hit them really, really hard, and then try for a negotiated settlement. Well, we should have known that that was never going to work. That's what the Japanese tried to do in World War II. It wasn't going to work. But we're trying something. We didn't know exactly what to do. Well, then we would have to identify important targets again and go hit them again, and then draw back again. Strong note now, the North Vietnamese are not stupid. Long Nguyen Giap, Ho Chi Minh, Le Duan, Le Duc Tho, all these other leadership in North Vietnam, they're not idiots. They're not stupid. So we would hit important targets and then draw back. And that gave them time to repair those targets or to hide them. And then we'd come back for round 2 or 3, 4 or 5 months later, and the targets were either repaired or they were gone. They disappeared. And so Rolling Thunder is just this continued attempt to hit them and then draw back, hit them and draw back, hit them and draw back, and it won't work. It gives them time to repair things. It gives them time to hide equipment. You know, it's a cycle of war, and they understand it very quickly, and they adapt to that, to their own advantage. But Rolling Thunder will go on and on and on, basically right to the end of the war. We'll hit them, and then we'll draw back and ask them if they want to negotiate. And it just doesn't work. Troop levels reach 200,000. Okay, so strong note here. Very strong note here. This is important. In Vietnam, our big general is going to be William Westmoreland. Now, William Westmoreland, I have his picture on another slide. He goes all the way back to World War II. And I'll talk about him again here in just a few minutes. And William Westmoreland, you know, he's super smart. He was in the Battle of Bulge. He'd been involved in the in the Korean conflict. He's been to every military academy there was. He's really, really popular with the troops. And he says, okay, in order to do this Rolling Thunder thing, we've got to have Air Force bases. Well, then, in order to protect the Air Force bases, we've got to have soldiers. Lots and lots of soldiers. And then, because we have lots of soldiers there protecting the Air Force bases, just sitting in a defensive perimeter, that's a loser game. That yields the initiative to the enemy. You can't do that. So I need more troops, number one, to run the Air Force bases and to guard the Air Force bases. I need troops that do that. But then I need soldiers to go out and act offensively, find the enemy and destroy them. And so troop levels reached 200,000 because LBJ kept seeing the logic in that. He was listening to his military commanders and giving them as much as he could, gave them what they want. But I want you guys to think big here. Think big. This is the strong note I want you guys to take. And most historians that talk about Vietnam don't talk about this. Please understand that we also had huge troop commitments in Korea. We still do. We had huge, huge troop commitments in Europe. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men in Europe waiting for, you know, the Red Army to attack in Europe. We also had huge troop commitments in the United States as a rest area and to train other soldiers. In other words, you could be in Korea for a while, and then you get done with that tour, 18 months or a year, whatever it was, and you had to have someplace in America to go back to continue on with your training. And you'd be there for a year or two. Same thing in Europe. You'd be stationed in America, get your training, then go to Europe for a year or 2 or 3, and then be rotated back to the United States. And so we had big, gigantic army bases, military bases in America. Then, well, now, all of a sudden, in 1964, 1965, we need to have 200,000 more soldiers stationed in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. And that, ladies and gentlemen, led to a draft, a peacetime draft. America officially is not at war anywhere. It's part of the Cold War. We're not at war in Korea. It's Cold War. We're not at war in Europe. It's Cold War. We're not at war, you know, anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And we're not even at war in Vietnam. It's not declared. But we have to have troops in all of those places. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, support troops, logistical people. And this is extremely soldier expensive. And that meant a draft in peacetime. And that's very, very unpopular. LBJ had to spend a lot of political capital. He had to make speech after speech after speech in America. Said, listen, we've got to have a big, giant, powerful military. And most people were okay with that. Until their kid gets drafted. And then they're not happy. So this peacetime draft begins to turn American attitudes against the war. LBJ is still for it. He can sell a lot of people on it. Most people in America, you know, 1966, they're actually for the war. They understand why it's there. plus many of the adults, you know, they've been in World War II. And they all say, listen, if your nation calls, then you have to go. But in 1966, we get the first anti-war protest. Now, what's important about that, ladies and gentlemen? There had been anti-draft protests all the way back in the Civil War. There had been a few people that resisted World War I. Like Alice Paul, she's one of them. She didn't agree with the war. When World War II, before the war, everybody was isolationist. We've talked about that extensively. But then World War II came along, and because of the nature of the war, there were no isolationists during that war. But then Korea came along, and people didn't understand why we were there. You know, the Cold War was a new thing. And so finally, in American history, for the very first time, you actually get organized anti-war protests. This is the first time in American history. These moms and dads don't understand why their kid has to get actually drafted and then sent to Europe, sent to Korea, or, worst of all, be sent to Vietnam. Moms and dads don't understand that. And if you're 17, 18, 19 years old, you didn't really understand either why you were being compelled into the military. So we get the first anti-war protest. They start out very small, they're very localized, but then as time goes on, it gets worse and worse and worse. The next year, 1967, the war escalates, and so the protest escalates. And you get, in America, you get a very negative cycle. There are more and more soldiers getting put into Vietnam to try and win. Westmoreland wanted to win. He saw the war as winnable until the day he got out of Vietnam. But to win, he said, he kept saying, I need more soldiers, I need more guys. LBJ said, well, we want to win, we don't want to lose. So I'll give you more guys. Well, the other commanders in, Korea and Europe, they said, yeah, we need more guys too. The red threat is real. We got to have more people. And so we just had to have more and more people, which meant more and more draftees, which meant more and more people that were very, very unsatisfied with what was going on. And that led to more and more protests. All right? So, in conclusion here, I guess before I go to the next slide, I just want you guys to be thinking. This is another mistake on the part of our politicians. Some of the guys, especially Mcnamara, were starting to wake up to the idea that we got to get out of Vietnam. It's unwinnable. We don't have an exit strategy. The South Vietnamese are not putting up that much of a fight. They're not getting involved as they should. The North Vietnamese are dedicated. There was a growing recognition that the Russians had no real interest down there, and neither really did the Chinese. And so there's a recognition growing within the administration, we got to pull the plug. But there was just no way out. We were stuck. It was a quagmire, and that's what people called it at the time, a quagmire. A quagmire, for those of you guys don't know, is a big giant mud hole with no bottom to it. And you step into it, and you start to sink, and the more you thrash around, the faster you sink. So that's what a quagmire is, and we were in it. So with that in mind, next slide. 1968 is a turning point in the war. And the next, I got it all the way down through, Tet, Battle of Hue, My Lai, that's all, it's 1968, LBJ 1968, MLK, RFK assassinated. This is all really that decade of turmoil. So 1968 is a turning point in the war. Strong note here, and please don't get lost. This is complex. So in late 1967, William Westmoreland, his picture's on the very next slide, William Westmoreland, he's our big general over there, a 3-star general, about to be a 4-star general. Very trusted, very knowledgeable about what's going on. He has a clear vision. In 1967, late 1967, he had gone back to America and hit all of the television talk shows. Meet the Press, all of those, CBS Sunday, all of those Sunday talk shows. That was a thing in America even back in the 60s. and everybody would be home. Dad would tune into that and watch and catch up on all the latest news. And so Christmas, William Westmoreland is home on leave, and he goes on all the talk shows, and he says, strong note now, we are winning and we will win. His single message on CBS, NBC, and ABC, the only three networks that anybody could get at the time. This is long before cable news, but he kept saying to everybody, we are winning and we will win. Quote, we are winning and we will win. And so here's this general in his, Class A uniform with medals that go from his, from his stomach to his shoulder, just medals all over the place. Telling everybody very clearly and unambiguously. It was a very forceful personality, and he said, we are winning and we will win. And so everybody had faith about that. Everybody believed him. Fine. But that leads us to the next step, and that is Tet. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's a Chinese New Year. It's the Vietnamese New Year. It's a lunar New Year. That means it kind of moves from day to day, month to month, year to year. And so it's a very mobile holiday. But it's 2 weeks, sort of end of January, first part of February. Tet. The New Year, it's a lunar New Year, and so it's a little bit mobile, but it's 2 weeks, end of January, beginning of February. Tet is very much celebrated. It's celebrated even today. You go and talk to family. You have big meals. Everybody trades a lot of gifts, and there's a lot of presents. You celebrate your ancestors. There's all sorts of things going on in Tet. It's a very, very important holiday in Vietnam, even to this very day under the communists. Very important holiday. So what's important here, ladies and gentlemen, with that in mind, is that this whole time there'd been an unspoken, unwritten sort of agreement with North Vietnam that during Tet, no offensive operations, no military operations. During Tet, everybody quietens down, allow the celebrations to go on, do what you need to do, have a good time. No fighting during Tet. And this has been kind of an agreement this whole time. Continue on with strong notes. So Vo Nguyen Giap, he's the mastermind here, and he sees this as an opportunity. So all through November and December 1967, Vo Nguyen Giap is infiltrating lots of extra men, lots and lots of extra supplies. He's keeping everybody quiet. He keeps saying, shut up about this, a big giant secret mission. But he crowds in hundreds of thousands of men, tons and tons and tons of supply, gathers all sorts of equipment. And he plugs all that into the South, all secretly, all undercover. He's using the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That is on a map in the subsequent slide. If you need to pause this and go to take a look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, pause this, go forward a slide or two, take a map, take a look at the map, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so, late 67, Vo Nguyen Giap got his guys all ready to go. Then our guys go back to all the military bases and start drinking beer and having a good time. They go home on leave or whatever. Go to Thailand, go to Japan, go to Hawaii, go on leave because it's a quiet time. And that's when Vo Nguyen Giap struck. That's when they hit. It was a big surprise. It's a giant surprise. And it's called the Tet Offensive. One of the elements of the Tet Offensive is called the Battle of Hue. That's how you say that word, Hue. And the Hue is a provincial capital at the time, but it's also this big cultural icon. It's on the Pearl River in Vietnam. It is an ancient site. There's all sorts of palaces, and it's this huge cultural site. But the North Vietnamese are able to grab it, and this is a symbolic victory for them. Strong note here. What's important about Tet is that just a couple of weeks before, Westmoreland was saying, we are winning and we will win. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, is this surprise offensive, where hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese guys show up. They're able to infiltrate the American embassy down in Saigon. There's fighting in Saigon. There's fighting in all the provincial capitals. They take over Hue. And so it looks like our guys are incompetent. Please write that down. It made Westmoreland look incompetent. Continue on with strong notes. The Tet Offensive was a disaster for North Vietnam. Everybody today agrees with that. Today, anybody that takes any sort of analytical look at Vietnam, at the Vietnam War, knows that Tet was a disaster. In other words, the North Vietnamese were out in the open where they could be destroyed. And our guys could do that. We had helicopters, we had big bombers. We knew where they, once we knew where they were at, we could isolate them and just overwhelm them with firepower, just destroy them. And that's exactly what they did. Our guys fought hard, they recovered quickly, and they beat the crap out of the North Vietnamese army. They beat them badly. One of the lowest estimates was 80,000 North Vietnamese were killed during the Tet Offensive. It was a catastrophe for them. The Viet Cong, that is to say, these North Vietnamese that were like infiltrated, that were insurgents, they were referred to the VC, the Viet Cong. They were out in the open. And they could be killed, and they were. In huge numbers. We just shot them down. But the North Vietnamese will win the psychological war. They will win the propaganda war. While we were beating the crap out of them on the ground, all the newspapers, all the film guys, we didn't have any kind of censorship. They were there, and all they could see is our guys are having to shoot and fight for their lives. And the North Vietnamese were obviously, they were not saying what their losses were. They kept saying, we're winning. We're the ones that are winning. And so, while we won on the ground, and we did, they won the psychological war. The North Vietnamese won the propaganda war. Please write that down. That is why it is a turning point in the Vietnamese War. So, the next step, the My Lai Massacre. Now, again, this is confusing. Don't get lost. Take strong notes here. If you'll take a look carefully at the slide, you'll see that My Lai is mentioned again at the second bullet point from the top on the right. And so, for the purpose of the presentation, I'm tying both these together. My Lai Massacre, 68, then 1969, the news breaks. So here's what happens in My Lai. My Lai was in Kon Tum province in the Central Highlands. Don't worry about where that's at. It's kind of isolated. It's a whole series of little villages out in the middle of nowhere. But our guys knew from experience that the villagers and the people in and around My Lai hated Americans. Hated Americans. Our guys knew that. It's just the nature of it. You just pick up that vibe. You pick up that sensibility from, being around the people. So our soldiers suspected that in and around My Lai, in this whole series of villages, not just one, but it's a bunch. The main one was My Lai, but we felt like that was a communist stronghold. That may or may not have been true. Under any circumstances, here's the story. Our guys were patrolling along that area, and bang, a sniper got one of our dudes. Killed him. And our guys are angry, they're upset, they're really mad, they just got out of all these battles. Things are very, very confusing even for the soldier. And so they went to My Lai and they said, who did it? Who is the shooter? You got to give him up. You got to give up the sniper. And the villagers, the young men have long since been chased away. They're either hiding in the jungle, or they're fighting for the North, or they're dead already, or they've been drafted in the South Vietnamese army. So you're talking about old men, old women, little kids, farmers. But our guys keep saying, who did the shooting? Who's the sniper? Who's it at? Who is it? Where is the guy? And I'm sorry to say that our guys got out of control. And they murdered a bunch of these villagers. Shot them. Kicked them in a ditch and shot them. And that's not what our guys do. Our guys are supposed to be the guys in the white hats. But these guys got out of control. And they just murder these villagers. Some estimates have as many as 300. That's probably a little bit high, but it's more than 100. And our guys just kicked them in a ditch and shot them, killed them. Well, one of our guys got out a camera and took a picture. Now, if you Google that picture, I recommend that you do not. Please do not. And this time when I say don't, that's not an invitation to do it. I mean don't do it. Because these pictures are horrible. I don't even put them on my presentation here, and you guys know I don't sugarcoat anything. But one of our guys took a picture. Okay, well that photograph, now listen, back in those days, we're not talking about an iPhone or something like that. You actually had to have a camera. Then the picture was taken, and then you send it in, and it got developed, and the soldier got it back. It's an actual photograph from a camera with a negative. So this photograph started getting passed around of all these dead Vietnamese, in a village. All these dead villagers kicked in the ditch and shot. And it went around and went around. Another guy said, well, let me get a copy of the picture. So it got developed like, I don't know, a dozen times off the same negative. And this picture started going around. Now, strong note, here we are, end of 1968, the Line Massacre took place. Strong note now, the press asked the Army in a press briefing, hey, what happened at My Lai? And the Army said, you know what, we're trying to get control of that, an investigation's going on, and we're gonna nail this down, and we'll let you guys know. Well, okay, fine. The press said, all right, we got it. So months and months and months go by, and this photograph is being passed around, and finally, and that's that second bullet point on the list on the right there. Finally, one of these soldiers showed that picture to a reporter, and the reporter said, wow, that's really a gruesome photograph. Hey, what happened? That's what reporters do. And so the soldier said, yeah, here's this village, My Lai, and our guys got, sniper bagged one of our dudes, and the guys retaliated, went in and shot everybody, murdered them all. Well, this news reporter reported that, got a copy of the picture, got the idea that the Army was trying to cover it all up, which is true. The Army was trying to cover it all up. And so that got reported in America. That our soldiers, frustrated, angry, seemingly out of control, were just going from village to village to village, just massacring people, just killing everybody, which is not what our guys do. So there was a trial. A Lieutenant William Calley, don't even write that down, but Lieutenant Calley, he was made out to be the only one guilty. Everybody else got off the hook, and that was seen as a wash. That was seen as a cover-up from the Army. Even then, Lieutenant Calley, he only spent a few months in jail, and then they said, well, here are all these mitigating circumstances, so they let him out of Leavenworth military prison. And that looked bad on the Army. That here's something terrible had happened. The Army was directly responsible for that, but they were letting the guys go. And so, what's important here? The press turns against the war. What's important about My Lai? First, obviously, is our guys are out there massacring civilians, which our guys do not do that. We don't do that sort of thing. We don't conduct ourselves that way. But more importantly to the war and to the United States, the press turned against the war. Very famously, Walter Cronkite, again, he'd been big in World War II. He was the voice of Middle America. If you need to Google Walter Cronkite or, YouTube him, that would be great. But Walter Cronkite came on CBS News. He made a big dramatic sweep and took off his glasses and spoke straight into the camera. And he said, listen, I've been to Vietnam several times. I've tried to get control of this. I've tried to understand what's going on. And Walter Cronkite said, we got to get out of Vietnam. The only thing we can do as people of the United States is get out of Vietnam. And LBJ saw this that night on CBS News. And he said, if I can't keep Walter Cronkite, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. Now again, it's symbolic in many ways, but it's another mistake on the part of our administration. They should have found a way to get out of the war immediately. Immediately get out of the war. But LBJ especially just couldn't see a way to do it without making America look bad. And that would play into the hands of the Russians or play into the hands of the Chinese. He just couldn't do it. So the war goes on and on and on. So back to that middle bullet point on the left, LBJ refuses to run for re-election. Again, LBJ, he's trying to struggle with this. And my position, ladies and gentlemen, LBJ was destroyed by Vietnam. His biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, she's still out there as a historian. She's very active as a historian. She was a young historian at the time, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she is LBJ's biographer. She talked to him for hours and hours and hours, got his story. And she very briefly made the point, listen, all LBJ ever wanted anybody to do was just to like him. He just wanted people to like him. You know, he wanted to be positive towards everybody that he met. Fair enough. And LBJ found that everybody was blaming the war on him. And so, very famously, he had a news conference, a televised news conference. He talks for a little while, makes this speech. And finally he says, consequently, because of the Vietnam War, I choose not to run in the next election. And this was a disaster politically. The Democratic Party was not prepared for that, and they had to go out and find a candidate. The Republicans were saying, yeah, well, that leaves us an option. We're going to get us out of the war, which is exactly what Nixon began to run on. So LBJ, again, the Vietnam War destroyed him. That's my position. That's the position of most historians. It's certainly the position of Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote the biography on LBJ, a book about the big as a cinder block. It's huge. Back in America, the turmoil continues. Martin Luther King is assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy, who had been running for president, and he was going to win, but he got assassinated. I have that on another presentation. So this turmoil, this confusion, in the 1960s, Vietnam is part of that. These assassinations are part of that. But one of the last things that happens is LBJ agrees to the Paris peace talks. He says, let's get our diplomats together and start talking. He said this publicly, and here is the strong note I want you guys to take. The North Vietnamese saw this as an indication that they were winning, which was true. Once we agreed to negotiations, the North Vietnamese felt like if they just hung on, they would get everything they wanted, which was true. But LBJ said, listen, the last thing I'm going to do on my way out the door is try and get some negotiations going with the North Vietnamese, the United States, South Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese, and trying to get something started, get some talks going. But that simply signaled that the United States wanted out, which was true. And the North Vietnamese saw this as a signal that they were winning if they just could hang on, which was true. So in 1968, Richard Milhous Nixon is elected. Again, the Democrats could not put together a good candidate. RFK was going to win, but he got shot. We tried Eugene McCarthy. He's not going to win. And so Nixon got elected. And he got elected on two major points. Number one, get us out of the Vietnam War. Number two, he said to the middle class, I'm going to have a society that obeys the law. I want stability. And the middle class really did like that. They saw all these hippies, a new development. They didn't like that. All this marijuana, they didn't like that. The middle class did not like that. Law and order. That's what they wanted, and that's what Nixon said. Nixon said, I'll get us out of Vietnam and law and order. That's what he said. So Nixon is elected. Now he's in office. He got elected in 68. He's in office in 69. And in 69, top of the column on the right there, secret bombings. So, strong note. Nixon, in a way, deceived the population. And he will continue to do that his entire presidency. He said he's going to get us out of Vietnam. But then the minute he had the opportunity, he escalated the war. So how can you do secret bombings? Well, this is the way it would work, ladies and gentlemen, very quickly. Nixon would tell the North Vietnamese, listen, we want to end the war, end the war, end the war. But you've got to do it. You know, we've got to give us something. You've got to promise not to invade the South. Well, the North Vietnamese said, no, we want a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control. So we could never get an agreement at all, even in principle. So this is what would happen. The negotiation would break down, and Nixon would send in the bombers. Well, this is very, very unpopular in the United States. So how do you keep these bombings secret? And this came out in the fog of war, and people that were like involved in Vietnam, they said this again and again and again. This came straight from Nixon. So it was a policy. The bombers that were stationed in Vietnam would stay on the ground. They would stay at Tonkin Air Force Base or any of these other Air Force bases that were out there. They would stay on the air bases. Then the North Vietnamese would report that they'd gotten bombed. And our guys would simply say, no, that's a lie. Our bombers were on the ground. You reporters could go out there and see the bombers. They were on the ground. They were at Tonkin or wherever they were at. Well, we also had bomber stations, ladies and gentlemen, in Thailand and in Guam. And those bombers would take off. And the reporters there would say, where are you going? What are you guys up to? And they would say, no, we're either going up to the DEW line as part of the Cold War, or it's a training mission. We got to go out someplace and, bomb some defenseless island someplace so we can hit it. Instead, they would go to North Vietnam, dump out their bomb loads, then go back to Thailand or Guam. And then say, yeah, the training mission was over. It was a success. We did a great job on it. But we were just out there training. No, they weren't. They were bombing North Vietnam. Then the North Vietnamese would complain about it, and we would say that that's a lie. It's a propaganda trick. And that little trick worked for a long, long time. Then you can see me lie. The news is going to break. Kent State, I will have that on another presentation. That happened. Kent State is a terrible, terrible event in America. Again, these students are like, they don't want to go to Vietnam. They protest on a college campus. Kent State is in Ohio. And some of them are shot. They're murdered, gunned down. Well, not necessarily murdered, but they're gunned down by the Army, the National Guard. And so this creates a huge uproar in America. But back to the Vietnam War. In other words, Kent State, again, it's on another presentation. So when you go to the Nixon administration, Kent State, I have a 15 or 20-minute presentation just on that. Secret negotiations, Kissinger versus Lê Đức Thọ. So these are secret negotiations, and the way it will work. Now, again, Kissinger, he's still alive, as it turns out, as I'm recording this, and he has admitted to it many, many times. We know that this was his policy. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be a Friday night in Washington, D.C., and Henry Kissinger, the then Secretary of State for Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State for Richard Nixon, he would go out there and tell his reporters, hey, nothing else going on. It's over with. I'm going to have a quiet weekend at home. I'm not doing anything. And the reporters there in Washington, D.C., are you not going to do anything? Nothing going on? Nope, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to go golf. I got to do this. I got to do that. And I'm not going to do anything. Okay, fine. I will see you Monday morning. Well, then he would leave the State Department. It's located in a place with a kind of an odd name. It's called Foggy Bottom. But he would leave the State Department and drive from Foggy Bottom and go out to Andrews Air Force Base, which is in Washington, D.C., get on an unmarked airplane and fly to Paris. There he would meet with Lê Đức Thọ. I have his picture on an earlier presentation. And he would meet with Lê Đức Thọ, the foreign minister of North Vietnam. And they would talk things over. Now, Kissinger kept saying, now listen, this is a good cop, bad cop situation. Kissinger would keep telling Lê Đức Thọ, listen, I got to deal with this Nixon guy. And Nixon, there's no telling what he'll do. So the best thing you can do is make a good deal with me. Because if you, Lê Đức Thọ, if you don't make a good deal with me, Kissinger, I got to go back and tell Nixon, and there's no telling what he'll do. And Lê Đức Thọ would not make a deal. He would say, we want South Vietnam to give up. We want the Americans out, and we're going to have a unified Vietnam under North Vietnamese control. He never deviated from that. So Kissinger would say, well, listen, I'm going to go back to Nixon and tell him that, and God knows what's going to happen. So Nixon would get the message, and he would say, well, now, again, this is part of a plan. Nixon would hit him with the bombers, unleash the bombers, hit him again and again and again. They would mine, they would put sea mines into Haiphong Harbor, the main harbor for North Vietnam. One of the big generals at the time, was none other than the big general who'd like been in control in World War II, and his name escapes me all of a sudden. But he's like, listen, I'm going to bomb everything. I want to put a bomb in every rice paddy in North Vietnam. And so the bombers, you know, they were just going in. And then Kissinger would fly back to Washington, show up on Monday as though nothing had happened. A couple of weeks later, they would do it again and again and again. Curtis Lemay, that's the bomber's name, the bomber general's name. It suddenly reoccurred to me. Curtis Lemay was like, listen, I want to put a bomb crater in every rice paddy in North Vietnam. I want to destroy them, bomb them into the Stone Age. That's where that phrase comes from. Curtis Lemay. So that would go on and on and on. So why are they secret? Strong note here. Why secret negotiations? Because Kissinger is there for the United States talking to Le Duc Tho from North Vietnam. And the South Vietnamese know nothing about it. We're cutting the South Vietnamese out of these negotiations. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, to make it clear, we're stabbing the South Vietnamese right in the back. We cut our allies out of these discussions. 1971, the Pentagon Papers are leaked. Now, the Pentagon Papers, they are a series of documents. I have all of that again on a different presentation. But a Pentagon official, he is going to take a bunch of these copies of these documents that were secret documents in the Pentagon. That's the military headquarters of the United States of America. And so he would take these off and get them copied. Now, back in those days, getting something copied was like a really big deal. Copy machines were had just then been invented. So this Pentagon official would go over there and get these papers copied and then give them to the New York Times. The New York Times would then evaluate these papers and put them out there and, print them. Strong note now, what the Pentagon Papers showed. Strong note. What the Pentagon Papers show is that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson had been systematically lying to the American people about Vietnam. Eisenhower, Kennedy, and LBJ had been systematically lying to the American people about Vietnam, about the troop levels, about what we'd been doing there, about all of these things that had gone on in Vietnam. Strong note. Now continue on with strong notes. None of this had anything to do with Richard Nixon. None of it did. None of it had anything to do with Richard Nixon. It was only about Eisenhower, LBJ, or Kennedy. But Nixon did not like leaks. He didn't like leaks. And all these papers kept coming out. And Nixon said, I want that leak stopped, which leads directly to Watergate. Now, in 1972, Nixon's going to get reelected. And again, he got reelected on, we're going to get out of Vietnam. Peace with honor. That's what he kept saying. Peace with honor. And we will reelect Nixon. And again, I have a presentation on that. I think it's entitled 1960s Part 2. And it talks about Nixon, and it talks about all the things that Americans really wanted in Nixon in 1972. And that he was actually a very, very popular president in 1972 when he was elected. But Watergate broke, and that same year, a couple of good reporters got out there for the Washington Post, got on the trail of this Watergate incident, and it made Nixon look really, 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 really bad. But Nixon kept going on with the war, But finally, basically on his way out the door, in other words, Nixon kept saying, I don't want to be the only president of the United States, the history of the United States, to be the loser of a war. He didn't want that. But there was no other way to negotiate out of it. So finally, we had negotiations, and Nixon kept pushing for it because he saw the end was near. And he said, you know what? Okay, I'll get us out of Vietnam. So this leads to, and this is the last bullet point there, in 1973. The policy was called Vietnamization. Please write that down. Vietnamization. Nixon and the generals went to the people of the United States and said, listen, we're just going to do a handoff. We're going to give all this equipment, all these plans, all these helicopters and bombers and jet fighters and weapons and all this equipment. We're just going to give it to the Vietnamese and say, listen, go settle this yourselves. And then our guys can get out. And the people of the United States said, yes, we will do that. Now, this was a mistake. This is our final mistake, really. Because as I pointed out before, Vietnam, they had an economy that was based on rice and fish. I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I mean their entire economy was based on rice and fish. And so there was no way they were going to be able to support this huge industrialized war where you need hundreds of helicopters, and they all need fuel and training and equipment and spare parts and big giant jet fighters, and they needed training and logistics and fuel and spare parts. The South Vietnamese economy could not stand that. But we handed all that over to the Vietnamese, and we got out. Now, it's not on here, but the real tragedy of Vietnam, 1975, the North Vietnamese are going to renege on their promises. They had promised in the negotiations that they would not attack South Vietnam. The Americans got out. Their promises were all lies, and we pretty much knew that was the case. And in 1975, the North Vietnamese had pulled together all their equipment, all their money, all their training, all their soldiers, and they launched this gigantic attack. South Vietnam just collapsed. And some units fought very hard. Some units did fight very, very hard. But the infrastructure just wasn't there. The morale wasn't there. The training wasn't there. There were just too many problems. And so Vietnam collapsed, and it was brutal. By that time, Le Duan was in charge. And as I pointed out on an earlier slide, he was a vicious, brutal, brutal dictator when it came to what was going on in South Vietnam. So it was a terrible tragedy. God knows how many millions of people were killed in the Vietnam War, how much treasure was spent on this terrible, terrible conflict, and based on a misunderstanding. Had we reached out to Ho Chi Minh, I don't go for counterfactual history, but if we had actually listened to him, all of this could have been avoided. If we'd have treated Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist instead of a communist, that could have been avoided. Le Duc Tho, later on, he's going to talk to Mcnamara. Mcnamara, he admitted to this. And Mcnamara kept saying, are you trying to lead me to believe that China was not calling the shots behind the scene? And Le Duc Tho said, yeah, that's exactly what I want you to believe, because that's the truth. We've been trying to escape Chinese domination for hundreds and hundreds of years. We didn't want the Chinese in there. We used the Russians, which was true, because the Russians had no territorial interest in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese are not going to use the Chinese, or use them as little as they can. Not let the Chinese in as advisors. Not let the Chinese in for equipment. The North Vietnamese will always depend on the Russians, the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had no territorial interest. But we just didn't see it that way. And so it was the policy of containment of the domino theory, and it led to a catastrophe on our part. But the real loser of the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese, they are still a nation that is destitute. As I'm recording this in 2020, Vietnam is still not really recovered from the war. It's been nearly 2 generations now. And their economy is only just beginning to revive a little bit. Le Duan, first he had to die. He had to go because he was destroying the economy. And Communist Party, they had to get really, really weak, become more of they had to embrace more and more capitalism, which is the only way their economy can recover, which is what's happening now. So with that in mind, I have a couple of slides that are all about the icons and picture analysis, and then we're out. I'm almost done. So very quickly on this, just a couple of minutes. The slide, we'll take a look at the pictures here. On the left, you can see the Ho Chi Minh Trail in red. We were forbidden, our guys were forbidden from flying into Laos or Cambodia. The American people wouldn't put up with it. And the North Vietnamese just exploited that. They dominated Laos. They destabilized Cambodia. And they set up this series of trails. When we think of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, I don't want you guys to think of some kind of like highway. It is not. It is a spider web. Those red arrows and that red mark there, don't think of that as any kind of meaningful road. It is a spider web. And as a spider web sort of trail, you can't get a whole lot of material through there at any one time. On the other hand, if you blow up one part of the trail, everybody can just use another part. It's a web. So it can't move a whole lot of equipment or fuel or ammunition at any one time. It's very inefficient. But it's also very resilient. You destroy one part of the trail and another part becomes active. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was impossible to stop. Again, it's going through a jungle. Take a look at the background of this slide, and that's what the jungle of Southeast Asia looks like. Some of these other pictures there, taking a break at Quang Tri Province, 1969. Look at the age of that guy. You know, it's a young Marine. I can tell from the equipment that he's got on. He's a Marine. He's in the Marine Corps. The average age of the soldier in the Vietnam War was 19. That's not my age demographic. That's your age demographic. You know, straight out of high school and straight into, you know, Saigon or Da Nang or Quang Tri or Kon Tum Province in the Central Highlands, out there going around there in this jungle heat. The next picture, that happens to be the Army. They're out there. Those guys are in camo. They got a canteen going, trying to get some water down. For those of you guys who are kind of military enthusiasts, you see the one guy's got a Thompson submachine gun. That is strictly in country. Most guys only use an M16 or an M14. But that guy seems to have laid his hands on a 45 automatic submachine gun, which in a jungle setting was probably pretty enthusiastic find. But imagine trying to operate in conditions like that, like the background of the image. You know, it's hot, it's infinitely humid, it's a jungle setting from which our guys had no real training on, and we're fighting an invisible enemy. So, you know, really, really difficult for our guys to operate under those conditions. In this slide, again, just to put some of the faces to the name, you see in the picture on the left, that's Lyndon Johnson there in that kind of tan jacket. Again, Lyndon Johnson had been in politics since the 1930s. For a very short period of time, he'd been in the Army Air Corps in World War II. That didn't work out really well, so he went back to Congress. But he sees the war in terms of win or loss. He sees the war in terms of the policy containment and the domino theory. The problem was that LBJ, surrounded by all these men who were really genuinely super smart, had no meaningful exit strategy. Next to him is William Westmoreland. Again, he's in kind of a combat fatigues there, but he was World War II. Really a forceful guy, super intelligent, been to all the military colleges. And he kept saying, we are winning and we will win. Until he died, he was very, very confident that we were going to do well in Vietnam, that it could be done, that the North could be defeated. The bomber generals, especially Curtis Lemay, again, I couldn't think of his name earlier on, now I can't get his name out of my head. He kept saying, listen, the Air Corps can do it. We can bomb them and bomb them and bomb them until they're ready to give up. The guy in the middle of the slide there in the kind of the gray suit, his name is Chu. He was the political leader of South Vietnam. Really briefly here, because it's not really a history on Vietnam, South Vietnam, but I want you guys to understand that the Vietnamese government in the South was very unstable. They had one political leader after another. They all turned out to be corrupt. You had an imperial government under Bo Dai. That was also very corrupt. For about 18 months there, almost 2 years, there was rule by the generals. And the generals were also very corrupt. They were only about personal aggrandizement. Finally get Chu in charge. And Chu is, I can't overemphasize this, was a true patriot for his country. He wanted an independent South Vietnam, and he fought for that hard. But he was so uncompromising that he would not talk to the North. And he kept demanding that the United States stick up for South Vietnam, and he wasn't going to let him go. And so after a while, we had to like stop supporting Chu, which brought in Chi. He's the guy in the brown suit. Now, Chi spoke excellent English. I think he's actually, I'm recording this in 2020, and I think he's actually still alive. But he's articulate. He's super smart. We turned him into a fighter pilot. He can actually execute a carrier landing. He was that good. He was dedicated to continuing on to the war. And so we basically put Chi in charge. Well, Chi, after a while, he recognized that he didn't want to be a puppet. And so he's out, and Chu is back in. And Chu, I'm sorry to say this, but it's true, until his last day, he was living in America at the time, but he kept saying, you know, America stabbed him in the back, stabbed him in the back. And that was a pretty accurate assessment of the situation. Some of the icons there, you can see these helicopters. This is a rapid war to try and get control of the insurgents. Our answer was to use technology, and that is one of the icons of the war. And those are called Hueys, UH-1 Hueys. And they would carry, I don't know, 10 or 12 guys. They're exciting to ride around on, I have to say. And they would make these assault landings, dump out a bunch of guys, and then go get the next bunch, So you could get a local concentration of troops by helicopter in a very, very short period of time. And many times, our guys got the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese by surprise by control of the air. B-52s, broadly speaking, those are called arc lights. That's kind of the code phrase for what you see here. You just get a bunch of these bombers. In other words, that's not a Photoshop. You get a bunch of these bombers kind of side by side, and they just dump out their bomb loads. And that's referred to, the mission itself is called an arc light, but actually bombing in that way is called carpet bombing. And you find an enemy troop concentration, and you locate it, and you call in the B-52s. And they're up, 35, 40,000 feet. And they dump out their bomb loads. These are gigantic bombs. You can just take a look at them. And just bomb the enemy out of existence, which is exactly what Curtis LeMay was saying. Bomb them into the Stone Age. And he had that strategic tool that could come from Thailand or Guam or Japan or South Korea or anywhere else in the Pacific Basin and, bomb the crap out of people. The North Vietnamese. The last picture that you see there in the lower right, protest. This is just a good picture of, the 250,000 people are going to protest in Washington, D.C., and that would never happen in American history. And these people are adamant. They're putting their foot down, and they're telling their political leadership, we want out of the war. And so by, 1969, when that photograph was taken, the people of the United States of America wanted out. And finally, Nixon, whether you like him or not, I think that Watergate, when I was a little kid, that was all I was on TV. Watergate was bad. From Watergate, and I've had this on another presentation, after Watergate, we no longer trust the government of the United States of America. We know they're fully capable of deceiving us and lying. And that was bad. But Nixon did promise to get us out of the war, and one way or another, he did. It may have been ugly, but he did get us out of the war. He owned up to that promise, finally, eventually. So the Vietnam War, a catastrophe. The better setting of this is part of the 1960s as a decade of turmoil. The war itself was a terrible tragedy for the United States. It was a mistake after mistake after mistake by men who thought they were doing the right thing, which is the tragic part. But thank you for your attention on this, ladies and gentlemen. I have one more slide, which is basically the lead out. Thank you. The turbulent 1960s, the Kennedy administration, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, assassination, LBJ and the Great Society. That's all in a separate presentation. Civil rights is in its own presentation. You've just got done watching Vietnam and an Arab protest. That is in another presentation. So thank you very much for your time and effort, and good luck on the final. Thank you.